The U.S. to lift those punishing tariffs on key sectors like steel, aluminum, lumber, autos.
Alcohol, dairy, and energy, all three made the list of demands from the U.S. if it is to remain in the three-way trade agreement with Canada and Mexico known as CUSMA.
Power doesn't always show up with tanks or speeches. Sometimes it arrives wrapped in trade demands, buried inside policy documents, and delivered through quiet press briefings. Right now, North America is living through one of those moments. 5 demands, 1 trade agreement, and a decision from Canada that caught Washington off guard. This is not a routine economic disagreement. It is a collision between sovereignty, supply chains, and political ambition, with consequences already rippling through markets, boardrooms, and government offices. Stay through the end, because what unfolded here exposes far more than a trade dispute. It reveals how fragile leverage becomes when economies are deeply intertwined. Sometimes global trade makes its intentions clear in ways no policy paper ever could. And North America is living through one of those moments right now. The United States, under Donald Trump and his trade team, has laid out 5 hard demands that Canada must accept to keep the current trade pact alive, whether called CUSMA in Ottawa or United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement in Washington. These are not technical adjustments buried in legal language. They strike at the core of Canada's economy, its cultural policies, and its right to govern itself. Canada's response came swiftly from Mark Carney, who has effectively become the country's chief economic strategist in this confrontation. There was no counteroffer and no drawn-out back and forth. Every demand was rejected. From the outside, that kind of answer looks reckless, like a smaller country daring a larger one to blink. But beneath the surface, this was not bravado, it was calculation. The U.S. Trade Representative, Jamieson Greer, framed these demands as the cost of extending the agreement for another 16 years, with the threat of renewed tariffs on steel, aluminum, lumber, autos, and energy hanging in the background. It follows an old protectionist playbook built on the belief that trade only works when one side loses. That thinking refuses to die, even though decades of data have proven otherwise. Washington's list reflects long-standing grievances: access to Canada's dairy market, dismantling digital media laws, loosening provincial alcohol rules, changing government procurement policies, and altering energy regulations. Each point targets a specific pillar of Canada's system, but in putting all 5 on the table, the U.S. also revealed something else, something far more important. It showed where it feels exposed. Carney's refusal makes sense once the bigger picture comes into focus. North America no longer functions as 3 separate economies that happen to trade with one another. It operates as a deeply integrated production network. Supply chains weave back and forth across borders, energy grids interlock, and factories depend on components that move constantly between countries. Disrupting one part of that system sends shockwaves everywhere. Take the auto industry. It did not appear among the 5 demands, and that omission speaks volumes. The North American auto sector is among the most interconnected manufacturing ecosystems on Earth. A single component can cross the border multiple times before a finished vehicle reaches a dealership in Michigan or Ontario. Executives from General Motors have already told lawmakers that breaking this system would cost tens of billions of dollars and throw production into chaos. Yet tariffs that threaten exactly that outcome remain on the table. Here lies the irony. By spelling out its demands so clearly, Washington handed Canada a roadmap of its own weak points. In any serious negotiation, showing your cards only works when every card is strong. Energy alone illustrates why that confidence may be misplaced. The U.S. imports nearly 4 million barrels of Canadian crude oil every day. Refineries along the Gulf Coast are built specifically to process Canada's heavy crude, and switching to domestic alternatives would require massive and expensive retooling. During winter peaks, parts of New England rely on Canadian hydropower to keep homes warm and businesses running. Energy does not flow one way, it is a shared lifeline. Seen through that lens, Carney's stance looks less like defiance and more like realism. He understands that tearing up the trade agreement would hurt American consumers, manufacturers, and energy markets almost immediately. This is not a one-sided dependency. Modern trade conflicts no longer revolve around tariffs alone. They revolve around supply chain resilience and strategic leverage. Washington appears stuck in an outdated mindset that assumes market size is everything. Yes, the U.S. consumer base dwarfs Canada's, but Canada supplies many of the inputs that make American production possible. That distinction matters. Ottawa has also been quietly widening its options abroad, including tentative outreach to China on selected agricultural and electric vehicle trade issues. This does not signal a wholesale pivot away from the United States. It sends a message that Canadian exporters are not permanently locked into a single market. In economics, alternatives create bargaining power. So now there is an administration in Washington issuing demands that play well domestically, but clash with economic reality, and a Canadian leadership team responding with unexpected resolve. Dairy, digital policy, alcohol rules, procurement, and energy have been framed as an ultimatum. But ultimatums only succeed when the other side fears the fallback position. Canadian officials appear to have weighed their choices carefully. Accepting every condition would hollow out key national policies. Standing firm shifts pressure onto American industries to rein in their own government. That is the wager. Auto manufacturers, energy producers, tech firms, and business groups will eventually make it clear to Congress and the White House that detonating North American trade harms American jobs and profits. It is a risky bet, but it rests on hard numbers, not emotion. The first flashpoint, dairy, captures the tone of the entire dispute. For decades, American politicians have fixated on Canada's tightly managed milk market. The complaint is familiar. U.S. farmers can export limited quantities tariff-free, but anything beyond that faces steep duties that can approach 300%. On paper, that sounds extreme. In a perfectly free market, such barriers would be hard to defend, but agriculture has never operated in a vacuum. The United States props up its own farmers through subsidies, insurance programs, and price supports that funnel billions of taxpayer dollars into the sector every year. Canada uses quotas and tariffs to stabilize farm income without direct government payouts. The mechanics differ, but both countries shield their producers. Carney brushed aside the technical arguments and declared supply management off limits. He delivered that message in French, speaking directly to Quebec, where dairy farming underpins rural communities and cultural identity. No Canadian government can afford to abandon that base. Ottawa had already reinforced its position weeks earlier by passing legislation that permanently protects supply management. This was not accidental. By turning policy into law, Canada removed its own flexibility. Negotiators can now point to the statute books and explain that there's nothing left to bargain over. In strategic terms, narrowing your own options can strengthen your hand, and that is exactly what happened here. While dairy reflects the old economy, the next battle sits squarely in the digital age. Washington wants Canada to dismantle its Online Streaming Act and Online News Act. The streaming law requires platforms like Netflix, Spotify, and YouTube to invest part of their Canadian revenue into local content. The news law compels large tech companies to compensate publishers when they distribute or reference journalistic work. From the U.S. perspective, these rules hit American firms hardest, and that is true. American companies dominate the digital ecosystem. But calling this discrimination misses the deeper issue. Digital markets tend to concentrate power rapidly, and Canada is attempting to preserve space for its own cultural industries inside platforms designed to scale globally. This clash exposes a larger tension between free trade ideals and the reality of cultural influence amplified by technology. Canada argues that without intervention, local voices will be drowned out by algorithms optimized for global reach. Washington argues that any constraint on its tech giants undermines open markets. Both sides frame their position as principled. Both are protecting strategic interests. Markets are already reacting. Investors are watching energy flows, manufacturers are running contingency plans, and policymakers in Ottawa and Washington are being lobbied aggressively behind closed doors. The outcome will shape not only tariffs, but how North America manages economic sovereignty in an era where supply chains and data streams matter as much as physical goods. Whether Washington absorbs that reality remains an open question. If it does not, the region may soon learn how much damage outdated ideas can inflict before they finally collapse under their own weight. But does that logic apply to the news ecosystem that keeps a democracy breathing?